I'm Alex Del Sordo with the Rower's Choice Network, and this is episode 5, season 3 of our podcast. And we've been doing this long enough now. We've been doing this for over a year now, and each and every week I get to talk to somebody about rowing, and it's one of my passions in life. You all know that. And this is a unique one. This is someone that's been in the U.S. system for many, many years. And I usually pride myself on knowing who everyone is. And I don't know who this is. This is Cam K, because I cannot pronounce his last name. Cam, thanks for being on the podcast with me today.
Very good. Thanks for the opportunity, and yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
So it's Cam. I'll cut to the chase. It's two guys talking about rowing. That's all it is. All right. So it's super easy, super casual, and I start every single podcast with the same question: where were you? How old were you when you started rowing? Give me that first experience.
Sure. Yeah, it was back in high school, and my math teacher said, "Hey, Kiosoglous, you've got one talent, and that's talking a lot. I want you to come and sit in the back of the boat." So I was, 13 years old and quite the appropriate size at the time for starting as a coxswain, and had a bit of a rough patch back in Sydney, Australia, where I'm from, in playing cricket, and the opportunity to boss a bunch of big guys around was, it was a good idea at the time, and somehow I've kept it going for until now, at least.
Oh, so I'm not going to age you, but it's been a long time, I imagine, right? It's been a long time.
Yeah, it's been a long time, but it's been a good time. I've been able to spin around the world a bunch of times and go to places I never would have gone to, and met people I never would have met. So it's been it was a wonderful surprise at the time, because I knew nothing about rowing, and I'm still learning today.
I like that you said you still learn today. So that's great. Now, Sydney, Australia. I've been to Australia. It's quite a place. I thought Australia knew how to row. I mean, truly, like you guys had Cox quads. You invest heavily in the sport of rowing. You basically have celebrities. When you row and you are successful in Australia rowing, you're a celebrity. Did you have any success in your time over there in high school or around that time?
Yeah, that's a good question. Rowing in Australia, it really is a lifestyle, and I think there's a lot of similarities between rowing, particularly in the high school level. In some ways to rowing here in the US, but definitely to high school rowing in the UK. But for me, it was a really nice blend between playing rugby in the winter time and rowing in the summer. And to directly answer your question, my last race in high school was probably the worst race we could have had. It was really disappointing. We went to a bunch of national championships, and for a smaller program, not unlike some of the smaller programs over here that focus on sculling, we didn't have an 8, so we primarily focused on the 4, the Cox 4. But I learnt to scull at the very beginning, so I knew a little bit about what was going on, and they would they'd strap me on the erg from time to time, and I definitely felt like that was an important part of my own sort of development as an athlete. But to be honest, I actually focused on playing rugby after I finished high school, and one of my buddies said, "Hey, listen, we need a coach, and can you just come out and have a look at us?" And that one conversation, for me as a brand new coach, sort of changed the game, and so I think it captured my attention, and like many of us, I don't think we ever really knew that we were going to end up in this sport for life. It was just sort of something. It was a good idea at the time, but I think that's the one thing that I think things like what you're doing here and what others are doing, that sharing this message that rowing truly is a lifelong sport is it's a powerful thing. Now, whether you've had success as a youngster, or success at the beginning, I think you'll find that talking to really successful people, and those that have continued on, they're actually fueled not by the success, they're actually fueled by one event that really was incomplete, was unresolved, and they won't let that go. And I think not to go straight to the professional game, but Tom Brady refers to his college experiences and remembers, where he was placed in the draft. And I think that reminder of, why we keep doing this is a pretty important piece.
I have been interviewing people for a long time, and no one has ever put it that way, Cam, that there was one unresolved event that forced them into the sport forever. That's such an interesting thing. Now, you focused on rugby. Someone said coaching. Do you know your one event that said, you know what, I'm going to stick to coaching. I'm going to stick to this sport forever?
No, because I still, someone said this to me a long time ago in the coaching game. You're only as good as your last result, and I think that mindset that you never know when it's going to be over has always sort of stuck with me. I think particularly at the highest level, you just never know if someone's going to turn around and say, "Hey, you're done." Yeah. So look, I think the main takeaway for me really has been, we do it because we love it, and I think that's the primary reminder. But at the elite level, the level of competition now is like never before, and I think we're seeing that not just trickle down, but it's evident at the collegiate ranks. It's definitely evident at the high school ranks that the smallest mistake in a heat or a repechage or a semi changes the trajectory of not only the regatta but the season, and for some people, what they choose to do moving forward in the sports. So I think being pretty aware that we've got a good thing, but it's not forever. It's a good way to just keep things in perspective.
I like that. So, okay, so you trying to get my timelines here. So you started rowing, but you were in the Cox and you did some sculling in Australia. Someone said, "Hey, we want you to coach," and you really focused on that avenue of the sport. At what point did you come to America? Like, at what point did you move your whole life to this country?
Yeah, so I was a high school economics teacher in Australia and coaching rugby and rowing through the 90s, and then moved to Japan for a couple of years because I'd studied Japanese. And dear old Ed Hewitt and Row 2K, there was a job going in Washington DC, and the parent group at Jeb Stuart High School in Falls Church, Virginia, said, "Hey, come on over for a couple of months, teach our kids how to scull," and really that was the turning point. So I got into a master's program at Marymount University there, not far away from Jeb Stuart in Northern Virginia, and sort of that was the beginning of that was 2000, 2001, and then when 9/11 hit, I really had a big decision to make whether I was going to go back to Australia or stick around with this stupid rowing thing in America. And so I decided to stick around. I actually got into the PhD program at Virginia Tech, and that sort of that calmed things down, because obviously the first year of moving across the world, it's pretty uncertain, and then to throw 9/11 in all that, I mean, everybody's worlds were thrown to an end, and my family said, "What are you doing in America?" And I sort of somehow convinced them that everything was okay. And so yeah, that was probably, for me, that was probably a significant event after 9/11, and getting to the PhD program at Virginia Tech was when I sort of said, okay, I'm gonna hunker down with this thing.
Were you raising a family? Were you I don't know anything about you. Like, did you have anything going on?
No, just single guy, just chasing around rowing boats, pretty much.
You said something so funny. You said this stupid rowing thing in America. The number of coaches and people that call rowing stupid always astounds me, because it's the truth. I say it. I hate it. I hate rowing.
Yeah.
Like, I have this love-hate relationship. That's interesting. So early 2000s, it's so funny. Like Ed Hewitt wrote 2K, and you see on there, like, there's this job, right? It's so funny. So you get this PhD, so clearly you're a smart guy. What happens after you graduate with your PhD? What do you do? Where do you go?
Well, it took me a while. Getting into the program was enough of a battle, but in 2001, 2002, Ken Dreyfus and I connected, and I was helping out with the sculling program at PBC, Potomac Boat Club. And in 2002, one of our scullers, Brett Wilkinson, got together with Steve Gillespie, and they rode the double in 2002, and they were looking for a coach. And so when I coached those guys in '02, that was my first team, first national team, and then they went on and qualified the boat in 2003, and then Steve didn't make the quad, but Brett did in '04, and I ended up coaching that boat. We went through qualification and raced in Athens. So, those couple of years, I'd found a job doing some work, actually, again, with some Japanese folks in DC. So things started to look a little less unorthodox, I'd say. It didn't look normal. And that's what when we say stupid sport, who gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning in the middle of winter to go backwards with a bunch of people you've never heard of before, and then just keep doing it day in, day out? I mean, that's the piece that I have continued to try and explain to people and think, have I completely lost it? So
Wow.
that's the bit. But the wonderful thing is it takes us to places and introduces us to people that really, that's sport, right? That's what we do. We just never would have have these interactions otherwise.
You go through an Olympic cycle and you're coaching a double. I mean, that's for most coaches, that's the pinnacle, right? Like they did it. They got to levels. So what happens in '05? Like where are you taking your life after that point?
Yeah, so I developed, a really good relationship with Chris Korzanowski, who's coaching sculling through the '04 cycle, and I started literally commuting backwards and forwards on a weekly basis to Princeton, and helped with Chris, and we had the quad, the men's double, White and the single, and the lightweight double there back then, and pretty much was in support of Chris through the Beijing, through the end of the Beijing cycle. So Jamie Schroeder, Sam Stitt, they both came through Potomac during that time, and ended up in that quad that finished fifth in Beijing. So that was and that was pretty exciting because it was really the first time since Igor's group in the '90s that we had a really good quad and a good. It was just a really deep group. There were a lot of really good guys, and it was.
So I was a Potomac man from 2009 to 2015, and Sam Stitt, huge shout out to this guy. He is the most gifted rower I have ever been with. The guy could gain 20 pounds in the winter, right? Look like he just got out of a bar, sit on the erg and break 20 minutes. Honestly, he's one of the most gifted athletes I have ever come across in my life. And the guy just knows how to move a boat. He's unbelievable.
Yeah, a lot of fun times with Sam, and absolutely gifted beyond belief. First time I saw Sam was in the early 2000s, and he was rowing a double with another guy that I didn't know at the time, but got to know very well, as Giuseppe Lanzone, and they were rowing out of McLean with Jim Mitchell. And you're right. I mean, even watching them in those early days, there was some real. Some would disagree with me, but some athletic talent between the two of them that lucky for us, they found rowing, and so I think that '08 quad with Juice and Sam, and others, it was a different time, and I think rowing, rowing shifted during that period because, as the women started to begin that domination in the women's eight. At the national team level, and things in many respects, they shifted around the world with rowing, and I like, Tom Teja's webinar that he did for us with USRowing talks about the evolution of technique, between 2000 and the 16 cycle, the 2016 cycle, and I think it's a good example of just how the sport has really shifted in the last 4 or 5 Olympic cycles. That again, to my point earlier, it's just become so much more competitive. The razor edge is so much sharper, and all the little details, they really, really matter. And how you balance that without becoming obsessive is that's the magic, right?
I am convinced, and I don't care what national team rowers listen to me right now. I think the best era of rowing was 1998 to 2006. the strongest, most competitive, fastest men and women I have ever seen. That's my favorite era of US rowing, bar none. The stories, the imagery, and I don't know, maybe because I'm 35 and I still think the youth has changed in today's world. What do you think of today's era national team athletes compared to when you were coming into it in the early 2000s?
Yeah, look, I think the demands are just there's just increased demands, and I think collectively we're being asked to do a hell of a lot more with significantly less resources, and that I think, yeah, I think we're always changing. I think, our parents' generation said that about us, their parents' generation said that about them, and so on. But I think there's such a rich history of rowing in this country, and I think there's such a rich history of sport across the US. And I think, one of the truly remarkable things for me when I first came over here, and I'm still learning this, is how the coach is sort of elevated in sport in America and in rowing, and at the national team level. Certainly the late 90s, that early 2000 period there was some really cool things going on. Obviously the men winning in Athens, the men's 8. The beginning of the women's. The beginning of Tom's, and Laurel's work with the women, but also the legacy that Spracklin left in the mid '90s, and to be honest, I think the work that Chris Korzanowski's done, prior to the '92 cycle, and then post 2000 has been, really like they're cornerstones, they're foundations that I think we need to be reminded of, because there's some really like the coach education work that we're doing right now. It's all because of Chris. It's all because of Chris's work that's been going for decades, And so I think to pinpoint, I ask that question often of some of those that I talk to and say, hey, what's your favorite race, or what's the favorite crew you've ever coached? And to pinpoint one particular period, I think, the next 6 months we're going to see so much in world rowing that's gonna draw a lens on everything that we've seen. Again, from our women through to what's happening in the UK with rowing. How are things shifted in Australia? Where does rowing in New Zealand go? I mean, I think there's internationally, because that affects everything that goes on here. It affects collegiate rowing. It affects what happens in the high school level. So it's going to be exciting 6 months.
You're absolutely right. Now, I want to touch on one thing you said about the difference is increased demands and less resources. Can you just explain that to me a little bit more, like on what you're seeing, like what limited resources there are compared to what it was 20 years ago?
Well, I think let's just pick one level. Let's pick our high school athletes.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect.
There's so many more choices for good collegiate programs to go to, and how often we all get calls of, where should I go? What should I do? How should I make my decision? In addition to all the other things, they're not just rowing. They're doing all these other things to make sure that they look like they can differentiate themselves getting into one of our college programs. Our college coaches are saying, who do I pick from? I've got these great kids in San Diego. I've got this kid that's athletic out of Oklahoma but doesn't know how to row. And I've got all these international kids that I'm looking at. And then from our side at the national team level, we're looking at how do we develop talent, knowing that the level of competition at the collegiate level, continues to get tighter. But we're also preparing athletes, that we see at the Olympic Games and the international level. So I think, at the very, very basic level, when you come out with a really, really good collegiate experience, the major question that we hear all the time is, what should I do? I want to row, but my parents have spent $500,000, or we've spent 8 years committed to rowing, and I don't know if it's worth not just another 4 years, but 8 or 12, because we know that the concept of overnight success is not real. But to really be successful at the international level, you got to stick around.
So I think about Sam Stitt as a good example, because he's like one that I can draw from, and I know that he did it for 12 or 13 years. Like, he went after it for 12 or 13 years. He hit his peak in Beijing, and it took I mean, he'll agree with me on this one. Like, he was still figuring out rowing in life later in his life. And today's, I don't call it youth, but today's general culture is you're going to find success year one. So that's a good point. Like, I understand what you're saying, that there's a greater demand, right, for other things besides rowing to be successful at. And then you tie in rowing, you want to win the Olympics. And it's a culture shift. It's a culture change that you got to like adapt to. And I look at some of the athletes this past weekend, last weekend, they were racing for the trials, and there's some women and men that didn't make it, and they've been trying for 10 years. And like that's it doesn't come easy, right? I guess what you're saying, it doesn't come easy. Um, that's a lot. That's a hard thing to swallow. And then, so I want to shift gears a little bit because you've been at this at a high level. I challenge that rowing is not exciting and fun to watch. And someone that is at the highest level, what advice do you have, or what can we do to make rowing more popular, more fun, more enjoyable for non-rowers?
Well, you're a rower and you're saying it's not fun. So why do we even need to worry about non-rowers? Let's focus on the rowers. I mean, I think the again at the pointy end, the the International Olympic Committee have said to us, if we don't figure it out, we're not going to exist the way we have.
Mm.
So it's coming from that end. But I think what I'm seeing, particularly from the pandemic, but even before that, is we all need to come together and we all need to innovate. We all need to be creative. And how we do that is there are no bad ideas. Now, there have been infinite creative ideas about our sport since the beginning of time. Whether it's not rowing on a straight side by side course, whether it's learning from sports like sailing, looking at what's happening in sports like the our arch enemies, the fun sports like BMX, what the winter sports have done, where there's risk factor. We have to think about the TV audience if we're going to survive at the pointy end. And I think coastal's exciting. I think that's moving in the right direction. I think indoor rowing is certainly going to continue to bring people into our sport that we never would have made contact with. But how we draw the connection between classical rowing, Olympic rowing, coastal, indoor, and I think one of the bigger messages is making making the sport landscape, and particularly rowing, more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive, so that it isn't just something that that you have to have. You have to be in the top 1% of the top 1% of the top 1% to even have access to the sport. I think that, and I go back to, again, my days on the Potomac and say, those little yellow boats that would float around, you'd have 10 to 12 people just bouncing around the Potomac, learning how to scull over the course of a week. I think that's the kind of innovation where, recreational sports like skiing and golf, they're not easy to do. They're really expensive. So, and they're a couple of the check marks for us. But how do we make our sport a little bit more accessible, just from a participatory perspective? But then secondarily, how do we make it more visual? How do we make it easier to get on bodies of water where it's not 2,000 meters, 8 lanes? It has to be all of the requirements that we have in the traditional format, and that's a part of our sport, but it's not the entire piece. And I think that's the broader sort of promotion that we're all talking about it. We're all trying to do a lot for it, but it's going to take time, for scholastic programs to change, for high school programs to change, for national championships. It's not just like, oh, we're going to change a sport overnight, and look at sports like beach volleyball. Look at, there are sports out there that have made adaptations, but look at a sport like rugby or soccer or American football. They're being forced to change from an injury perspective, right? And they're seeing the numbers drop, So we're not exactly in that predicament yet, but at the pointy end, if the IOC say you're out, I think it'll help college rowing. I think it'll help scholastic rowing and youth rowing on some level, but I think everyone within the international rowing community is working as hard as they can to keep our sport as relevant as possible.
So I got to tell you, it's funny. I don't know how much you know about Rower's Choice, but we made a conscious decision beginning of last year when the pandemic hit, to be that different, like to be the innovative group. And what we've learned is that there is a subset, there's a group in rowing that doesn't agree with you on the concept of no idea is a bad idea. People have like to me said, you're an idiot. That's not going to work. That's a bad idea. And I'm just thinking like, well, there's two kinds of people in the world, right? There's people that innovate and people that pull down the innovators. And we're finding that the people, and I generalize my term here, so I'm not, saying one or the other, but there is a group of people in the sport that have a louder voice than everybody else, that when there is an innovative idea, they say that's bad. And it's typically an older generation. Like it's an older generation, they don't like change, they don't like to adapt. So I just hope that there comes a point in our sport that no idea is a bad idea. Because right now there's a large people that disagree with your statement. And I agree with you. Like I'm all about it, Cam. Like I think, no, just try it. Why not? Right? What's the harm in trying? And I assume you agree with me on that, right?
Well, I'm not saying get rid of what has been the tradition. I'm certainly, I'm certainly a huge advocate of the history of our sport, but I just look at everything else we're seeing in the world, and I'll go as extreme as to say, we're being threatened by esport and time spent in front of a screen, and I think that I've resisted that, but for me, the pandemic pushed me over, and I said, hey, I was in the middle of the lightweight 4 removal from the Olympics. I do not want the traditional event change. I actually think, and I feel obviously quite strongly about the lightweight 4 as an Olympic event, that there was a better way to make that shift to absolutely having gender equality in rowing. Absolutely 100% agree with the premise. Was removing the lightweight 4 the best way to go? I had a few other ideas. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is let's sustain and really promote the historical aspect, but let's build around it. Let's make it easier for people to get into our sport. Let's make the sport even more fun, because it's not that it's not fun, but let's make it easier for others to come. And I know, look, there's always going to be resistance, and I think that's healthy. I think this is a really healthy debate to say, how do we maintain where we are, but we can't keep doing what we've always done. And stay relevant and I'll go back, and I think this is the best example. I've got some close friends in baseball, and they're having the same discussion. How do you maintain history but stay relevant? And there are other examples in the world that if you don't stay relevant, you're gone. And I think that's the age old, that's the balance in the debate. It's not change it and get rid of it. It's how do we evolve?
Yeah, it's so funny. I wrote an article. I recall an article. I wrote my thoughts down, and I said that baseball is the perfect example of the only sport to ever truly adapt to its surroundings. You look at when baseball started, and then in the 1990s, it was the steroid era, and they adapted to the world. Like people loved big explosions, and it was home run derby basically every damn game. And then it switched into like high velocity speed pitches, right? And like that changed in the mid 2000s. Rowing historically is the same thing it was 100 years ago. And this, like hull designs haven't changed drastically. The only thing that's changed is the materials that they use to build the boats. And knowing manufacturing that I do, I can attest to that. And it's the same 2,000 meters. I like your thing about maintaining history but staying relevant. That's a concise way to explain what we need to do as as a culture, of rowing. And I will add that rowing is fun. I just meant on an audience perspective. Like I love rowing, and I watch every race I possibly can get my eyes on, but it's not energizing. So then your perspective, again, you've been doing this a very long time. What do you think is going to happen to rowing after this cycle of Olympics? So in 2021, like we see the Olympics, you talked about this earlier. You said that there's going to be a big change in 6 months. The next 6 months are going to be exciting for rowing. What do you think is going to happen? What's your gut?
Yeah. The Olympics is always a bit of a reset. It's always a bit of a look around to say, okay, what's working and what's not. I think, the pandemic has really shifted everyone's perspective, and particularly the elite level of how to train. I think that's going to be a fascinating looking at the results to see who really figured out how to train in the pandemic and who didn't, and
Oh,
who
wow.
got it right, and who tried some things, and that's, we see that every Olympics, whether it's altitude training, wind suits, latest blade shapes, training methods. We always see the result of some kind of innovation at that highest end, and then what translates. But I do think, with coastal, with indoor rowing, that that there are going to be more examples of athletes trying to find different pathways to stay in our sport, and I think that's exciting. I think finding different avenues to stay involved and engaged. I think my bias right now is very much focused on what happens with coaching, and I think one of the things that I'm most concerned about is that the pandemic has pushed a lot of really good people out of coaching,
Mm.
and out of sporting organisations in general, and I think how we bounce back in a healthy way, because I do think the strength of the discussion about sports specialisation going into the pandemic was getting pretty hot and heavy, and coming out of this, my hope is that we're able to have better and more well-informed discussions. That the pandemic's taught us something. Pandemic's taught us a little bit about time to step back, and we don't have to train not as hard, but as much as we have in certain ways. The twice, 3 times a day, 6, 7 days a week. That more is better concept. I think that's really been challenged. And again, I think that the Olympics is going to be one of those true tests of what can what do we really need to do, and what's a nice to do. And I think that again, if I go into the real specifics of getting a lot of Americans to learn how to get in a single and row a single, maybe that's one of the best byproducts of the pandemic. And the pandemic has been horrible on so many levels, but maybe one of the shining lights for rowing is that it has got people to think about getting a single. And I know boat manufacturers love it, and I'm sure you're seeing it as well, of repairs of singles, and other sculling boats, but certainly that return to why we do this sport, and to be able to again learn a lifelong skill of getting in a single that you can do anywhere, anytime. Hey, how cool! So, like, touched a little bit on the pointy end of what happens at the Olympics, but I do think that's an important connection. It's not just what happens with the amount of medals that are won, but how does that trickle down? Because I wouldn't be in the sport. I presume for many people, if it wasn't some moment where you saw someone doing something at the highest level in our sport, you probably wouldn't have either got into it or stayed in it.
There's a couple of things that you really got me thinking hard about, and I love the reset button on the Olympics. I love that you said the pandemic has shifted training, and that at the end of the cycle, we're going to see who did it right and wrong, and then that's when innovation happens, right? Last question here, because we like to keep these things about 30 minutes. Is by the way, this is very valuable. I know a lot of young coaches are going to love this conversation, but I want to know who's going to win the men's 8, the women's 4, the men's 4. Give me tell me, what do you think is going to happen? Who's going to win the Olympics this year? The boats that I care about: women's 8, men's 8. So who do you think is going to win those? And then I'd love to know your opinion on the men and women's single. So give it to me. Who's going to win the 8 for the men and women?
Oh, Alex, I mean, I think I was out with the men's 8 with that group.
Tell me, yeah. How good are they?
In the last couple of weeks, and I'm excited with what's going on down with both groups. I think we've figured a lot of things out. I think that again the pandemic has been pretty rough, for everybody. It's been very rough for everybody. But I like what I'm seeing there. I think the German men. Hey, that's a tough one. I think there's been some changes over there, so that'll be interesting. But I think given that we haven't seen anything from anybody in, is it a year and a half? By the time we see something, it's going to be a year and a half. I think honestly, I do think it's a little early to make any real predictions. But coming out of what we saw in 19, you know, there's nothing between, those first 4 or 5 boats in either of the events. And what we see in the heat, will be it's going to be crazy. And remember, we haven't even gone through qualification, so there'll be another boat in each of those, that'll throw something. So I'm not going to directly answer it.
I'm going to directly answer it because that's my job and I'm allowed to. And I am convinced. I'm convinced with you on the U.S. side. I think the women's 8 will pull out another victory. I know there's a lot of fast crews out there. I know the Brits are really good. I know even Canada has a fast 8 right now on the women's side. Women's 8 gold, lock key, $100 on the table. I think the men's 8 is in the medal contention, but not a win. My gut still tells me that New Zealand and Germany are really strong boats. The Brits are tough. I don't know if they're going to go all in on the men's straight 4. But I think Tatey and that men's team has something special up their sleeve. I've heard nothing but great things, and I think they get a medal. I don't know about winning, but I think they're young and hungry, and I think that they handled the pandemic really well. And you can never count Tatey out. So, yeah, I think U.S. wins a medal. I think Germany, New Zealand, U.S. are the top 3 in the men's. Women's 8, they get it. Men's single, I'm kind of throwing up now. I have no clue at this point. I would love to see Ali Zeiler win, but I don't know, if he's capable of pulling it out. It'd be a cool story, right? Because, what a great story. And I don't know much yet about the small sculling boats. I don't know about the quads and the doubles yet. I think women, China is going to win a medal in the quad. And we're going to see a change in history coming up here. I'm convinced.
I agree with you. I think what's going on in China is that there'll be at least one really good medal contending boat. I think those small boats, what Kara was able to do in the single down at trials. Again, I'm going off what we've seen, and I think as we get closer, I don't want to speculate, but I think Kara and Jevy's, obviously got a very, very accomplished background. So for Kara to win that trial, those times don't lie, particularly down at Benderson. So at this time of the year, so and I also think if our lightweight women's double are able to qualify, which I think again it depends on who shows up, it depends on how they show up, and then you've got this whole other piece in Tokyo of it's going to be maybe like Beijing in terms of heat, but it's going to be different because a lot of people aren't going to be exposed to the heat. So you're going to see crews overperform like every Olympics, and you're going to see a bunch of crews underperform. So, I think the true test will be once we see how these crews come out in those first couple of World Cups to see how do we compare that to the data of a year and a half ago.
Oh, I get excited. Kara, she's a cool woman, man. She knows how to pull those oars. I get excited. Cam, this has been awesome. Thank you for your time today. And I know everyone watching or listening is going to draw a lot of really great things from this. Something that we care so much about is if we can get the message out there, coaches are going to learn from your experiences, and your experience is a unique one. I mean, you found rowing as a coxswain. You travel the world. You made gut decisions to stay, and you figured it out. And here you are, a successful coach in rowing. Cam, thank you for doing this with me today.
Thanks, Alex. Appreciate the time, and thanks to all your listeners. It's it's always fun to talk about rowing, and let's get back to it. Let's get back. Let's row smart. Let's row safe, and let's have our fun out there. So
and there it is. No, thank you, Cam, so much. That is episode 5, season 3 of Rower's Choice podcast. We'll see you all later.